Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Mr. Stephen Bradley. Stephen works at the intersection of technology, security operations, and policy to advance U.S. national cyber defense. He has over 20 years of experience managing the development and application of advanced data analytics solutions to support a variety of national security missions, including cybersecurity, through his work at the Department of Energy National Laboratories. He has also led cyber threat intelligence teams engaged in threat analysis, attack simulation, and threat hunting. In July 2020, he became the director of the newly formed Cognitive Security Intelligence Center, and in August of this year, he published a paper through the Carnegie Endowment Partnership for Countering Influence Operations entitled Securing the United States from Online Disinformation, a Whole of Society Approach. Stephen Bradley, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hi, thank you, John. Appreciate it. Looking forward to being on your podcast.
Well, we are excited to have you. And I'd like to start, see if you could please give our audience a little bit more background about your career and how this led up to being the lead for the newly formed Cognitive Security Intelligence Center.
Great, yeah. So it's been a little bit of a journey. As you pointed out in my introduction, I spent a number of years working at Department of Energy National Laboratories, and about 20 years ago, in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, I was leading a team of software developers, data scientists, doing some innovation in large-scale information fusion, which is essentially applying technologies like graph technologies, text analytics, visualization technologies. And at the time, we were pretty novel, and we were attempting to provide capabilities to largely the national security sector within the federal government. And again, in the wake of 9/11, our focus was on counterterrorism intelligence analysis. Did that for a number of years and was very exciting. But I would say over time, those technologies became less innovative and began to be commercialized or commoditized in open source libraries. If you think of things like Palantir, if you think of things like Neo4j, again, the technologies were kind of moving out into the commercial and open source space. So about 10 years ago, I pivoted away from that innovation and focused more on a mission application, especially in the area of cybersecurity and cyber threat intelligence. And again, it was very similar. It was akin to correlating large amounts of data, looking at indicators of compromise and cyber attacks, and correlating them and clustering them to figure out, were campaigns related, were there actors all working in concert, and that sort of thing. While I worked in that capacity, I managed threat intelligence teams, as you pointed out, and I was working with and supporting ISACs, information sharing and analysis centers, and that's largely how I ended up where I am today. Kind of thinking about the run-up to the 2016 election, I was, like many people, I was an avid user on social media. And I could tell something was changing, something was kind of wrong. You could see the rapid decline in the communities, and you could tell that things are becoming much, much more divided. And at first, I kind of chalked this up to a natural behavior, human behavior. But of course, then as attention started turning towards foreign meddling in the election, immediately realized of this national security threat. So we now know that propaganda is nothing new, but social media has really clearly become a game changer. If you think about the speed and the scale that disinformation can propagate, if you think about the potential to do your targeting and reach the audiences that will be most divisive, it really has changed the nature of propaganda. And so as I thought about the solutions to that kind of problem, I kind of thought back to my time in cyber threat intelligence and working with ISACs, and started to think about how could an ISAC be used to drive solutions to this particular problem of online disinformation.
Yeah, that's great. I think it might be helpful for our audience if you could tell a little bit more about what an ISAC is and how that fits into the discussion.
Sure, absolutely. I guess it was late 1990s. There was a presidential directive that mandated each of the U.S. critical infrastructure sectors to create a sector-specific organization explicitly for the purpose of sharing security information. It was a growing concern at the time that certain critical infrastructure sectors could be victims of cybersecurity attacks, and the collective security approach, where you have the private entities within those sectors all collaborating and sharing threat intelligence, would certainly help them protect themselves better. Those ISACs over time grew, and I believe there are 16 or 17 critical infrastructure sectors, mostly managed and overseen by the Department of Homeland Security. And they've matured over the last decade. Some of the more prominent ones include ISACs supporting financial services, energy, election infrastructure, and there's the Health ISAC, which was started by Deborah Kobza, who's the president of my parent organization. Again, mentioned that the historical focus has largely been on cybersecurity. Some of the ISACs have been expanding into physical security. And with Deborah Kobza's vision and others that I've reached out to, like Rand Waltzman, they see the need to push this beyond cyber and physical alone, and to push into what we call cognitive security, given the interplay between all three of those components. And so that connection between cyber, physical, and cognitive security is largely what drove the creation of the Cognitive Security Intelligence Center. Again, our view is that given the interplay, it's important to take an all hazards view of the threat landscape.
Fantastic. So let's move over into the article that you recently got published as part of the Carnegie Endowment Partnership initiative for countering influence operations. So the title, and we'll have a link to this in the show notes, is Securing the United States from Online Disinformation. And you assert that a whole of society approach is needed. Can you talk to us about that article, what drove you to write the article, and some of your recommendations that are contained within the article?
Oh, absolutely, yes. So again, my experience working with ISACs in the cyber world is what kind of got me started thinking about that as a potential solution. But as I peeled back the onion a little bit more and started thinking about how an ISAC operates and what those cyber threats look like, I realized that it can be applied immediately to disinformation and misinformation, but there's some key differences that need to be addressed as well. Cognitive security threats is all about hacking people, hacking minds, which is rather different from hacking cyber systems. And so I wrote that paper largely to shed some light on what I thought some of those key differences were, and to really invite some of the thought leaders in this area to engage in conversations about how we might solve some of those key differences. And then I suggested a couple of solutions to those differences that I saw.
Right. So when I think of cognitive security, I think about information operations which ultimately target the human brain and eventually attempt to tarnish decision making, or to sway or drive decision making in a direction which favors the attacker, whether the attacker is a nation state or a rogue actor. The ultimate goal is to affect the human cognition. So can you talk a little bit about the interplay between cybersecurity, cognitive security, and how you see some of those differences playing out in the information space?
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, we all think about what happened in the 2016 election, at least part of what happened. We think about the DNC hack. We know that that had a cyber component. The DNC systems were hacked, information was taken, and then leaked out to ostensibly to WikiLeaks. And so, that clearly has a very strong cyber component to it. But there are obviously many other kinds of ways to engage in cognitive threats or information operations in ways that don't always involve cyber or cybersecurity. And so there were three differences in particular that I thought about and wanted to write about in this Carnegie paper. I guess the first difference I would look at is what I would call capacity. If you think about the cybersecurity industry, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry with an absolutely huge market for tools and technology, training, certification, and whatnot. If you think about things like the RSA conference and all the corporate support they get, it really sheds a light on the size of that market. Cognitive security, by comparison, in my view, will always be much, much smaller. And that tends to make it difficult to drive innovation, technology innovation, makes it more difficult to advance the analysis and response tradecraft, and it's just in general to develop the workforce. And so one of the things that I'm advocating and I'm pushing for through our intelligence center is to collaborate with academic centers of excellence. We know who some of the key players are in this space, to essentially work with them to bring some new tools and innovations and emerging capabilities into an operational environment to serve as kind of an experimental platform. We'd also like to work with them to jointly develop training programs and establish internships. And so that really sets us apart from many of the other ISACs in going that extra mile and making sure that we build capacity in this space. There's actually a second difference that I see, and that is what I call the ability to assess the threat. If you think about cybersecurity, they have a wealth of frameworks and guidelines from things like the cyber kill chain, the MITRE ATT&CK model, the NIST cybersecurity framework. And these are all great tools that allow cybersecurity analysts to have common conversations about the risk or the threat or the vulnerability. And that's very helpful as a community to have that kind of capability. We don't have that capability yet today in the cognitive security community. There are some people doing some really great work in this space, Sarah Jane Turp, Pablo Brewer, and they've taken the MITRE ATT&CK model for cybersecurity, and they've gone to extend it for cognitive security, and they've made some great progress. But we're not really at the place where that's been widely adopted by the community, and the Intelligence Center on Lending will absolutely want to get behind that effort. But success would require a high degree of community adoption so that we have that common approach to fighting this fight. So when you also think about,
yes, excuse me, interrupt. What was that model that you just mentioned?
So that's called the ATT&CK model, ATT-ACK. That was developed by MITRE, and it was really a way to put a framework in place to talk about cyber threat actor TTPs and ways to drive decisions about response actions.
I thought that you had mentioned a early cognitive security model or an attempt to scope the cognitive security threat.
Well, one of the things I was going to mention is I think one of the ways we need to use a model is to be able to think about what the risk is of a particular cognitive threat and understand, how much attention, how much energy do we as a nation need to put into it. And so if I think about just, the core definition of, malign influence or disinformation, you think about the large number of ways that can manifest itself. And, I come up with some examples. Some of your listeners may be familiar with the Fire Festival of a few years ago. There have been a couple of documentaries that talk about that. And, basically, it was a social media advertising campaign to entice thousands of music fans to attend a festival in the Bahamas. And it was largely overhyped. It turned out to be a multi-million-dollar fraud and arguably a short-term health hazard. But if you think about an example like that, it's clearly disinformation. But what is the risk? Who are the victims? And how do we go about thinking about, is that something that someone like our intelligence center should address? And so, without having frameworks to come up with a taxonomy of threat actors and objectives and techniques and whatnot, it really becomes quite difficult. And you'll find that one organization talking about cognitive security threats might be looking at something very different from another.
Right, and that Fire Festival for the audience. There's a astonishing documentary. I think it's on Netflix or something, to check it out. It's pretty amazing how all of that went down.
Yeah, and I think I could rattle off a number of other examples of ways that disinformation kind of creep into society, and are probably not appropriate for an organization like mine to address. And what I advocate in the Carnegie paper is that it's really important for us to think about what are those threats that impact national security. And this is another reason I wanted to join Deborah Coates' organization. Is they're instrumental in reaching out to a number of critical infrastructure sectors. And right now, if you think about the focus of disinformation really being on election is one of those many sectors, if you will. But there are so many others that could be impacted in a negative way by disinformation that would pose a threat to our national security. And so again, without a taxonomy to really classify those threats and do some sort of risk assessment, it becomes exceedingly difficult to really put your arms around where you should focus.
Right. So a big discussion point these days is the role of social media. It's a new phenomenon that is being overlaid into our old brains. So humans have not evolved much in the last 10,000 years, but we have these new technological platforms which, unbeknownst to us maybe 10 years ago, it appears that they are quite good at targeting parts of our brains which are having impacts that we could not have foreseen 10 years ago. And now here we are with these social media platforms, creating problems that now need to be managed. How are you guys thinking about how social media fits into your desires going forward to create a whole of society mitigation response?
So it's a great question. I think about the number of stakeholders that would need to be involved in this whole of society approach. Social media platforms being obviously one of them. One of the ways that I think about the problem that makes it different from cybersecurity is this notion that in cybersecurity, and members that belong to cybersecurity-focused ISACs do so because of the collective security they get as they share the threat intelligence about the attempted cyber attacks on their own cyber infrastructure. As they share that information, that helps them protect themselves better. And that's a bit of an analogy that to some degree breaks down in the world of disinformation. And you think about the social media platforms as maybe being the enablers of that kind of threat, because that's where the narratives propagate. And so it's very, very important to have the social media platforms engaged. I think right now, if we think back on what's happened over the last year, I'm very encouraged that of the progress that's been made. I think given what's happened with the COVID-19 and the information and disinformation around that, obviously elections continues to be an issue. There are more and more issues that are now being presented where both the platforms and the public are becoming more aware of what disinformation can do and what that threat means.
Right. So in your paper, you also mentioned the 2020 NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, and the call for a social media data analytics center. Could you tell a little bit more about your thoughts along those lines?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So again, we are created more in the spirit of putting together a public-private partnership. And we noted that about a year ago, there was a call for the government to carve out such an organization. They noted that it should be a nonprofit organization, and the baton was handed to ODNI to create that center. I'm very encouraged that we have lawmakers that are forward-leaning and they're thinking about the problem in this way.
ODNI, for our audience, is the Director of National Intelligence, correct?
Correct. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
So again, I'm encouraged that we have lawmakers that are forward-leaning and looking in that direction and understand the benefit of that kind of organization being a nonprofit to build that relationship between private industry and their organizations. I have to say I'm not aware of any efforts in 2020 to advance that. But that said, of course, it's been a crazy year with COVID-19, which happened largely after that call was established. And when I think back to the way the ISACs were formed in the critical infrastructure industries, it took several years. And I think, building that relationship between private industry and government, building that trust, understanding what that partnership looks like, it does take time. And I suspect the journey will be very similar for cognitive security. But that said, I think it's very important that we keep these kind of conversations alive right now. And I'd be very interested in engaging with anybody in the government space who is trying to promote the creation of that kind of center.
Yeah, outstanding. Well, we will have links to these materials in the show notes, as well as a way for our audience to get a hold of you. So you and your colleagues are embarked on a very ambitious agenda. I'm curious, so what does the next year or a couple of years look like for the Cognitive Security Intelligence Center?
Well, very good. Yeah, so we are really just launching right now, and as I've mentioned, our operational model is based entirely on collaboration with a wide number of stakeholders, and we are reaching out to those stakeholders right now. We're building those relationships. We're talking to heads of industries and critical infrastructure sectors. We're reaching out to the online media platforms. And we're also reaching out to some of the research organizations and academia. Our initial focus is going to be on establishing our advisory council. Again, given the collaborative nature of what we're doing, we really want to make this a community-driven approach. We have several ideas how to build out our current existing capabilities to operationalize cognitive security, but we know that it will be critical to leverage our advisory council and its members to help us set near-term priorities and really to drive that community adoption. We're by no means building a collaborative, exclusive community. I've reached out to several stakeholders, as I mentioned, but it's a large and growing landscape, and I certainly could have missed some folks. If any people listening here would like to be a participant, they'd like to partner with us, I really encourage them to reach out to me.
Well, absolutely. Your project aligns very well with the kinds of things the Information Professionals Association is doing as well. So we are fellow travelers along this road of cognitive security, and we wish you and your colleagues Godspeed as you continue down this path. And with that, my guest today on the Cognitive Crucible has been Stephen Bradley. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, John. Appreciate the effort.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.